participant back. So, Dr. Diggs is going to join us online on Zoom, I think from Leeds or Paris, I'm not sure. But let me introduce him to you. Right, so Dr. Diggs is a very dear friend. He's a philosopher. He's an environmental philosopher. The beauty of this is that Dr. Diggs is not an engineer, but he's an environmental philosopher who is basically basically studying and analyzing the philosophy behind all that we are doing. All the talks yesterday happened on materials and in concrete and in Zoom, and all the talks that are going to happen today. The backbone, that backbone philosophy is what Dr. Diggs is studying. He studies environmental ethics, he studies philosophy of biomimicry. I hope that he starts with the definition of biomimicry at the beginning of his speech. And he has recently published a book, and I've got my copy, the Biomimicry Revolution, Learning from Nature, How to Inhabit the Earth. It's published by Columbia University Press, and I can't wait to start reading the book once it's done. So, Dr. Diggs, Henry, can I invite you to start your speech?
Okay, let me just try and share my screen first because I've got a PowerPoint presentation.
Well, that's right.
Share. Okay, all right, I'll go back to the beginning. Oops. Okay. If I put that on slideshow, sometimes there's a problem when it's on slideshow. When I scroll through, can you see is the screen changing? Yeah, sorry. So the first screen, realizing the biomimicry revolution. Can everyone see that? Hello? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my screen okay? If I scroll from one screen to the other, can you see that? No? Let me have a look in the chat. Yes, all good. Okay, right. Okay, I'd like to start just by thanking Aya. Aya, thanks so much for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real honor. Thanks also more generally for taking an interest in my work. I mean, you know, even this morning, you're integrating what I'm doing. It's very gratifying as a philosopher when people doing real work out there in the world take an interest in what you do. So thank you very much for that. I'm sorry I can't attend this conference in person. I've just got so much on, and it wouldn't really have been feasible from a practical perspective. Okay, so moving on to my talk. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about the concept of the biomimicry revolution. So here's a picture of Janine Benyus's book, Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. I expect almost everyone here is familiar with this book, given what you work on. And it's here that the concept of the biomimicry revolution is first introduced, as far as I'm aware. So on page 2 of her book, Benyus says, unlike the Industrial Revolution, the biomimicry revolution introduces an era based not on what we can extract from nature, but on what we can learn from her. And there are a few points I'd like to make about this. The first is the contrast of the biomimicry revolution with the Industrial Revolution. The second is the idea that underlying it is this general epistemological idea of learning from nature, of gaining knowledge from nature. And the third point is that Benyus doesn't actually say a lot more than this. To the extent that she talks elsewhere in the book about the biomimicry revolution, it's just in the sense that she provides some inspiring examples. Actually, not now, buddy. Sorry, it's my son. He's just going to school. Go away, buddy. Go away. Um, sorry, Patrick, please go away. Okay, so she just provides some inspiring examples. She doesn't really analyze the concept of the biomimicry revolution. And this is where I pick up from Benya's. So as Arya mentioned, I've just published a book, The Biomimicry Revolution, Learning from Nature How to Inhabit the Earth with Columbia University Press. And what I try and do in this book is analyze the philosophical foundations of the biomimicry revolution. So there are 4 chapters. The first chapter is all about what nature is, and I present nature as physis. So this is a Greek word from which we get our word physics, and I interpret physis as self-production. Nature is that which produces itself. I can't go into any more details about that here. And then in chapters 2, 3, and 4, I take up the 3 principles that Benya's presents at the beginning of biomimicry, in the epigraph: nature as model, nature as measure, and nature as mentor. And I tie those to a branch of philosophy. So technics, which I'll be talking about more later, ethics, and epistemology. So whereas Benya's just writes 1 sentence or 2 sentences about each of these principles, I write 60 pages. So I really explore these principles and what they're fundamentally about. A second thing that I do that's different from Benya's is bring in a historical perspective. So in Benya's, sure, there's a contrast with the Industrial Revolution, and that's it, really. Whereas I'm interested in how the biomimicry revolution is different from the Industrial Revolution, how it relates to how we've understood art and technology in other periods of history, and so on. I'll be talking about that in a minute as well. And then thirdly, perhaps more so even than Benya's, I relate biomimicry and related fields, biomimetics and so on, to the ecological crisis. And you see this in the subtitle of my book, Learning from Nature, How to Inhabit the Earth. So Benya's book, the subtitle is Innovation Inspired by Nature. There's no direct reference to, the environment or ecology or anything like that, whereas that's something that comes across more in my subtitle. And as Aya said, I'm an environmental philosopher, and this book is fundamentally a work on environmental philosophy. I present biomimicry as an environmental philosophy, from which, of course, you then get possibility of concrete design practices and so on. But those are, in a sense, kind of secondary to the sort of fundamental conceptual and theoretical changes which I think biomimicry is introducing. Okay, so what about today's talk? Well, I'm going to be drawing on my book, and I've kind of identified a strand of thinking in that book that I'd like to present to you. And I'm dividing the talk into 2 parts. So in the first part, I'm going to situate this idea of a biomimicry revolution with respect to history, especially the history of philosophical thinking about technology. And then I'm going to, in the second part, draw some conclusions from all of that about how we might realize the biomimicry revolution. Okay, so the historical perspective. Now, if you're a philosopher and if you come across the idea of biomimicry or biomimetics, you will inevitably make the connection with the ancient Greeks, at least if you were paying attention at university, because it was widespread in ancient Greece to see what they call techne, for which we get our word technology, but it covers also art and craft, as mimesis. So that's a Greek word for imitation, sometimes translated in certain contexts as representation, of physis, which is their word for nature, or at least it's often translated as nature. So if you look up the entry on philosophy of technology in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you can read this. Philosophical reflection on technology is about as old as philosophy itself. Our oldest testimony is from ancient Greece. There are 4 prominent themes. One early theme is the thesis that technology learns from or imitates nature. And this theme is present notably in Democritus, who gives lots of examples. You find it in Plato, and then perhaps the most famous reference is Aristotle, who theorized this idea in the Physics and the Poetics. There are, of course, differences from contemporary biomimicry. The ancient Greeks weren't trying to put forward a program for innovation. They weren't really concerned with, inventing new technologies. What they were interested in was a theory of the origin and the nature of technology. So when Democritus says that house building emerged through imitating the nest building activity of swallows, he was trying to explain where it came from rather than propose a radical new method for building houses or suggesting we might really learn from that to make better houses and things like that. And in fact, when you look at swallow's nests, you can see why he might have thought that house building came from that. The use of mud and straw and so on is something that humans have done too. Okay, the next period I'd like to talk about is the Middle Ages. And during the Middle Ages, the ancient idea that art is art in the broad sense of the creation of artifacts, including technology, the basic idea that art is imitation of nature was upheld. It wasn't contested, and yet because of the way they understood nature, it was understood very differently from the Greeks. So nature was seen as God's creation. And what that meant was that when you're imitating nature, you're ultimately imitating God, in the sense that you're imitating the ideas that God had that underlay creation. A key example of this way of thinking is Thomas Aquinas, who drew a lot on Aristotle. And analyzing this period, I argue that ultimately what you find in the Middle Ages is something that I call, by analogy, biomimicry, theomimicry. This is the idea of God as model, measure, and mentor. So the idea of God as providing ultimate models on which innovations are based comes from the idea that it's God's ideas that underlie creation. But God's also the measure, in the sense that he sets the standards we can only hope to, get close to at best, but never quite live up to. And he's also our mentor, in the sense of being a spiritual guide for humankind. And it's also worth noting, you do also find in the Middle Ages the idea of imitating God, imitatio Dei in Latin. So in the Bible, you can read that we should be imitators of God. From the Renaissance onwards, another important change occurred. The ancient idea of art as imitation of nature was again upheld explicitly, and yet somehow it got changed into something else. So just as imitating nature changed into imitating God in the Middle Ages, well, in the modern period, it changed into imitating man. And it did this by means of an argument, which was generally that the human being is the greatest thing in nature. What's the point of imitating anything else in nature when the best thing in nature are human beings? You also find the idea that human beings, in some sense, contain the rest of nature. So the early Italian Renaissance architect, Francesco Di Giorgio Martini, said that human beings contain the minerality present in the mineral realm, in the form of bones and teeth and so on. They contain the fundamental trait of plants, which is to grow. They contain the fundamental trait of animals, which is to be sentient. And they even have the rationality of disembodied angels. So the whole world is contained within humankind. We're a kind of microcosm of the world. So why bother trying to imitate anything else? You also find the idea in political philosophers. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan conceives the state as an imitation of man. He sees it as an artificial man, which he also says is the most excellent thing in all of nature. So that's modern anthropomimicry. A radical break then occurs in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in the form of German idealism. So two major German idealists, Kant and Hegel. The relevance of Kant is particularly visible in his conception of enlightenment. So this is summarized in the idea of sapere aude, dare to know, which Kant kind of glosses as have the courage and resolution not to turn to another for guidance. He's thinking, the idea is autonomy. The idea is you've got to think on your own. You've got to use your reason, your understanding, the information that comes in through the senses to develop knowledge without just relying on authority, whether it's the priests or, the Bible or whatever it is. But in rejecting this idea of taking guidance from another, you're also rejecting the idea of getting guidance from nature. So that's an important moment. Hegel, for the first time, as far as I'm aware, in the history of philosophy, directly attacked the idea of art as imitation of nature. He said that's the most common opinion about what art. And by art, he means not just paintings and so on, but boats and hammers and nails and various other things that he provides as examples. So there's this common idea of art as imitation of nature, and for a variety of reasons, Hegel rejects that and says, no, you know, the most simple human creation is better than any imitation of nature. This then paves the way for the emergence of philosophy of technology, understood as a branch of philosophy, an explicit branch of philosophy, which emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the first clearly identifiable work in the philosophy of technology is Ernst Kapp's 1877 Elements of a Philosophy of Technology. And in this book, he, in many respects, goes back to the anthropomimicry of the Renaissance, and his work could even be seen as the culmination of that. So each chapter takes a different set of technologies and says it replicates the human form. So hand tools, which are the subject of one chapter, he says all imitate, you know, the human arm and hand. So a spade is an outstretched palm, and an arm, and a hammer is an outstretched arm and a fist, and a rake is an outstretched arm and fingers, and so on. And then musical instruments are based on the forms in the human ear, and optical instruments, the forms of the human eye, and railways based on the sanguine system, and the state as a whole, as in Hobbes, is based on the human organism. Okay, so you might think, well, how does this fit with the idea of break, of no longer imitating nature? Well, what Kapp says is that he doesn't use the word imitation. To imitate is always to deliberately copy something. He used the word replication. Our technologies replicate the forms of the human body, but he drew on the concept of the unconscious, which had just emerged in Germany at the time and was later taken up famously by Freud, to say that we did this unconsciously. It was only looking back on it that we could realize that all our technologies had been replicating the form of the human body. So, you know, the key thing here for me is that we're no longer, with Kapp, seen as deliberately imitating nature. Other philosophers of technology went much further. Friedrich Dessauer wrote a book in 1927 called Philosophie der Technik, Philosophy of Technology, in which he said that technology is absolutely not imitation of nature. And he argued that where we've been going wrong for centuries, what had been holding technology back was that we were trying to imitate nature. And that was a fundamental mistake, he thought. He gives the example of aviation. He says, you know, as long as we're trying to make flying machines with flapping wings, it's not going to get off the ground. And it's only when we come up with a completely different solution that doesn't have any comparable, any comparison in nature, like the jet engine, that planes work. And he thought this was the case everywhere. Ultimately, for Dessauer, technological solutions never came from nature. They came from a separate realm, a sort of spiritual realm, a bit like Plato's realm of ideas, that he thought humans alone could access. And he thought they could access these technological ideas, bring them down to earth, and that ultimately we would replace the whole of nature, you know, cut down all the trees and so on, and replace them with these technological ideas that we access that belong to a separate realm and work completely differently from nature. Ernst Cassirer, a neo-Kantian in 1932, looked back on the work of people like Dessauer and other Franz Rouleau, other theorists of, you know, engineering and modern machinery and so on, and argued that the basic principle of modern mechanical engineering, so you could also argue of the Industrial Revolution, is that it no longer seeks to imitate the work of the hand or of nature. And then in 1957, the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg reflects on all this period and tells a story comparable to the story I've been telling. He goes back to the ancient Greeks. He says that for millennia, we saw art as imitation of nature. And then that idea eventually collapsed and was replaced by the idea of art as human creation. He doesn't talk about theomimicry and anthropomimicry. He doesn't talk about Kant and Hegel, but he tells a comparable story to the story that I've told. Another interesting aspect of Blumenberg's work is that whereas Kapp, Dessau, and Cassirer are only talking about technology, Blumenberg is also talking about art. And it's interesting that this change in technology, i.e. the view that technology isn't and shouldn't imitate nature, that was also present in art. If you look at art over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, how it's developed, common thread is the rejection of the idea of art as imitation or representation of nature. A major break is Impressionism. You're no longer trying to, imitate the objects. You're just showing the impressions they make on the human mind. Expressionism, abstract art, conceptual art, found art. My favorite example of this is Piet Mondrian. So that's the image that you can see here on the left. It's from 1921, so smack bang in the middle of this time where everyone was saying art is an imitation of nature. And he deliberately avoided the use of curved lines. He said, okay, so you get curved lines in nature, it's a cliche. I'm not going to use curved lines in my work. Similarly, the color of nature is green. Well, I'm not going to use green in my work, right? So, this composition in red, yellow, blue, black, as it's called, is kind of the opposite of what you would get if you were to wander into the wilderness and look around. You'd see lots of green and lots of curves, right? And this was very deliberate. He talks about this. This was the foundation of his work. He developed everything he did by rejecting the idea of art as imitation of nature and doing the opposite. Okay, so I'm going to move now to the second part, which is some inferences and conclusions. What can we learn from this story I've been telling? Well, I think there is a fundamental problem with philosophy of technology that people working in the field today are not aware of. And this is because philosophy of technology was grounded on the rejection of the idea of techne as imitation of nature. And the reason that allowed philosophy of technology to get off the ground was that previously you couldn't isolate technology because you always had to, see it in relation to nature, to the models or God or man or whatever it is that you're taking as model. Whereas for the first time, the idea emerged that technology was something totally separate that could be isolated on its own and take as a kind of singular object of study. So that I see as problematic, and most people working in philosophy of technology aren't even aware of this. They're not going to go back and read Kapp and Dessau. They're going to look at contemporary problems, and contemporary problems in the philosophy of technology take it for granted that technology is not generally imitation of nature. That's just not really a theme anymore in the philosophy of technology. The only minor exception being the 3 or 4 people in the world who are interested in biomimicry. Philosophy of technology is also problematic because it coincides with the Industrial Revolution, with modern mechanical engineering, which, as we've seen, is predicated on this rejection of the idea of art as imitation of nature. And then it also coincides with the emergence of ecological crisis. I think there's a kind of constellation of things going on here. The emergence of philosophy of technology, rejection of the idea of art as imitation of nature, the Industrial Revolution, and ecological crisis. These all, as far as I'm concerned, belong together. Of course, the situation is changing. Just as Hans Blumenberg was saying, well, we are all of the view today that art is not imitation of nature. When he was saying that in 1957, at that precise moment, biomimetics and bionics emerged. Otto Schmidt and Jackie Steele started introducing the opposite idea, but this idea came across as some sort of major innovation. There wasn't really that much awareness of the fact that, in fact, this was how art and technology had been viewed for thousands of years, because by the time they were writing in the late 1950s, it was pretty much universally accepted that technology wasn't imitation of nature. And biomimetics and bionics were viewed as very unorthodox innovation strategies. Even today, you know, non-biomimetic innovation is orthodoxy. Very often, biomimicry is presented as some sort of curiosity. I was reading an interesting example of biomimicry the other day. Some researchers have developed some tweezers that are based on the form of the crow's beak. Great, but these kind of tiny little innovations that sort of titillate and entertain people, you know, this is seen as some sort of curiosity from the hard work of genuine technological innovation in the form of, you know, software and AI and all of this sort of stuff. AI, of course, could be seen as biomimetic in many respects, but anyway, that's not often how it's thought. And a lot of these innovations, certainly originally in biomimetics and bionics, were not really ecologically oriented. The idea of a kind of ecologically oriented biomimicry or imitation of nature really, I think, was first, you know, developed in a sustained way by Janine Benyus. She was the first person to really say, hold on, this is the key, or a big part of the key to overcoming the ecological crisis, and that we need some sort of sequel to the Industrial Revolution. And if you look at the ISO 18458 on biomimetics, in a nutshell, biomimicry is presented there as sustainability-oriented biomimetics. It's biomimetics for the objectives of sustainable development. I wouldn't personally define biomimicry simply in that way. I think there's more to it than that, but that is a big part of it. But this revolution, this ecologically oriented revolution, is yet to be achieved. So the question then, and here I come to the title of my talk, is, well, how can we realize the biomimicry revolution? Now, I'm not going to provide a comprehensive answer to that question. I'm only talking about one aspect or one part of realizing biomimicry revolution. And it relates to the subtitle of my talk, The Death of Philosophy of Technology, or the End of Philosophy of Technology and the Birth of Technics. Now, you often hear people saying, well, the problem, what makes biomimicry or biomimetics difficult is a lack of interdisciplinarity. You know, we need engineers to work together with, you know, soil microbiologists or whatever it is. Okay, sure, that would help, but especially if you situate that idea just within a more general framework according to which the problem in the world is a lack of interdisciplinarity, then I think that this call for more interdisciplinarity is radically insufficient. I think we need to go further and not just take the disciplines as they stand and try and connect them to one another. I think we need to restructure how we think about the world, how we organize the disciplines, how we divide the world up. And in keeping with this, I think that the very notion of philosophy of technology is problematic. As it stands, you're either a philosophy of biology or you're a philosopher of technology. And if you're a philosopher of technology, because the origin of your discipline goes back to the rejection of the idea of art as imitation of nature, and everyone just kind of takes that for granted now, you can't really think about biomimicry. I mean, sure, I published an article in a journal called Philosophy and Technology called The Philosophy of Biomimicry. It's not that there's some sort of ban on doing this. It's just that as a general rule, people wouldn't really do that. When we organized a conference track on the philosophy of biomimicry at a conference a few years ago, hardly anyone turned up. You know, everyone's drawn to other aspects of philosophy of technology right now. Okay, so philosophy of technology, I see it, is problematic. And the solution I propose is to kind of reconceptualize how we think about the products that we make, how we think about them philosophically, And to that end, I propose the concept of technics, understood as the study of forms, materials, generative processes, and functions in both nature and human design. So this typology of imitable traits, forms, materials, generative processes, and functions, which I mentioned earlier and said he got from me. Well, he might have got it from me, but I got it from Aristotle. In Aristotle's physics, there's this idea that everything, whether natural or artificial, has 4 causes. Now, the notion of causes here is controversial and perhaps confusing, but you could say there are 4 basic traits to everything. Its forms, its materials, how it came into being, its generative, the generative process behind it, and its functions. And technics would be the study of these forms, materials, generative processes, functions, both in nature and in human design. Biomimetic techniques would involve taking the former as model for the latter. And I would propose techniques as a basic branch of philosophy. It doesn't exist today. No, you can't study techniques, right? You can study ethics, you can study epistemology, you can study philosophy of technology, which rejects the idea of art as imitation, technology as imitation of nature, but you can't study techniques. Okay, what would the implications of this be for what I call the technical disciplines? Things like engineering, design, architecture. And incidentally, if I use the expression technical disciplines, it's because I want to see them as related to this concept of techniques. What would the implications be? Well, I think, first of all, we need to sort of work towards rejecting the status quo according to which biomimicry is unorthodox and marginal, right? That was how it emerged in the 1950s, but I think we need to challenge that. To do so, I think it would help to integrate the study of what I call natural techniques. So, forms, materials, generative processes, and functions in nature, which involves not just biology and ecology, but biophysics and organic chemistry and all this sort of stuff. That would need to be integrated into the technical disciplines, which isn't to say, oh, all we need is more interdisciplinarity. It's not just about giving engineers lessons in biology and ecology, because it needs to be targeted, right? To the extent that it's particularly relevant for engineers, it needs to be a study of natural techniques, how nature does things, the forms, the materials, and so on, because in that, then it becomes much more relevant to people in the technical disciplines. And then a central element of the technical disciplines would also need to be not just techniques, but also biomimetic techniques, right? The principle, the whole idea of abstracting and transferring models and so on, all of that would need to be integrated as well. I also think that rather than seeing biomimicry as some sort of separate module, right, which maintains this idea of conventional non-biomimetic innovation as the norm, and then biomimicry as some sort of kooky alternative, I see that as kind of problematic. It's great that there are more and more master's programs on biomimicry. In the last couple of years, 3 master's programs have emerged in France that I've been invited to teach on. Great, I'm very happy to do so. But I think it also needs to be integrated into core programs of study at undergraduate level as well. I'm not saying that hasn't happened anywhere. I haven't sort of studied every single engineering degree in the world to sort of see to what extent this is already occurring, but it's just a general proposal. Okay, so I'm going to conclude now by talking a little bit more generally about the relationship between philosophy and biomimicry. Now, this proposal for techniques and biomimetic techniques is only one part of the biomimicry revolution as I see it. What else can philosophy contribute? Well, coming back to my work, especially my book, I think that 4 fundamental branches of philosophy: ontology, the study of being or nature; technics, the study of how nature does things and how humans do things; ethics, a study of standards and rules for action; epistemology, the study of knowledge, including the knowledge we get from nature. Philosophy can think about all of that, for sure. But At a more general level, I'd like to say something about what I think philosophy can contribute to biomimicry, or at least how it relates to realizing biomimicry revolution. And to do that, I'd like to draw on something Aldo Leopold said. So Aldo Leopold was a famous American ecologist. He wrote a text called The Land Ethic in 1948, which is now recognized as foundational for the discipline of environmental ethics. And what he says is this: the proof that conservation has not yet touched the foundations of conduct lies in the fact that philosophy and religion have not yet heard of it. In our attempt to make conservation easy, we have made it trivial. And now we have heard, philosophers have heard of conservation. There are thousands of lecturers in environmental ethics throughout the world. Conservation is discussed at important United Nations meetings and so on. Conservation has become important, but philosophers haven't really yet heard of biomimicry. If I say to my colleagues that I work on biomimicry, typically the answer is, what's that? With a bit of prodding, they can often work it out from the etymology. Okay, bios, life, mimicry, imitating. Okay, so it's imitating life. You know, they can just about get there, but generally they've never heard of it. When I say I work on the philosophy of biomimicry, typically the reaction is, I didn't know that existed. Like, what's that? You know, is biomimicry a suitable object for philosophy any more than, I don't know, looking around me, radiators? I mean, it's not taken seriously by philosophy. There's 3 or 4 people in the world working on this. So biomimicry is in a similar position to conservation was in the late 1940s. And I think that, you know, if we're going to take biomimicry very seriously, if it's going to be integrated into the heart of engineering, design, architecture, urbanism, and so on and so forth, then, you know, similarly to Leopold, I think it's important for philosophers to engage with it, because that would signal it's becoming something worthy of profound reflection and not just some sort of marginal curiosity. And in that, if that happens, then I think Benious's dream of a biomimicry revolution of comparable scope and scale to the Industrial Revolution, but that would also in many ways overturn the foundations of the Industrial Revolution, which was the rejection of the idea of art as imitation of nature, then I think that could occur. Whether it will or not, we'll see. I'm doing my best to contribute to this. I can't, as I said, be there with you, as I said, as is obvious. If you're interested in what I've said and would like to get in touch and talk about it, here's my email address. I also run a website, philosophyandbiomimicry.org, where you can find publications by myself and my colleagues who work on biomimicry. I have to say that my own publications, my own articles, I see as kind of out of date now. They were the sort of ideas I started working on. And then I kind of, you know, developed them, went beyond them, brought them all together in this book, which is available now for pre-order from Columbia University Press. There's even a discount, 20% off with the discount code CUP20. Aya, I know, has ordered 5 copies for his library, so that's fantastic. It'd be wonderful to get this book into libraries so that undergraduates can look at it. And yeah, if you're interested in the sort of things I have to say, I think this is the place to go. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I hope you found that interesting, and I hope you all have a great conference. I don't know if we have time for questions, Aya, or if we're moving on, but in any case, I'm done with the talk.
Do it now, otherwise I'm sure that we can find Henry's email address there and we can get in touch with him either for questions or what I had always in mind, the next bit that I'm writing, the next time that I'm going to put together an interdisciplinary, if you like, group of researchers to put together a research. If you are like me and want to have a philosopher on board, that could be your email address. Now, any questions from Henry at this point? No. Henry, thank you very much for your time, for the talk. I did enjoy it, and I've taken my notes, and I'm going to tie in what you said to the series of talks that are happening in the next hours, and bring that in my conclusion. So thank you very much. Yes. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. I have one question.
Thank you very much, Henry, for your very interesting and enlightening speech. And I must think, okay, I'm one of the older engineers here in the room. I must say, if I look back, I think as engineers, we've lost the connection to nature in the early 20s, 30s of the last century. And we should get back to that. And I think the way you highlight it, it's great. It will work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Henry. It's now time is, oh, I am still on time. So it's 10 to 11. Let's have a coffee break till 11, and let's start the talks at sharp 11. 10 minutes of coffee break. Thank you very much.